Hey, what's up, YouTube? Well, I'm making a video to try to help clarify questions about different types of 12 volt deep cycle batteries, how they're able to be used, and the importance of recharging them. Now, I had several videos that I've made over the years about my inverter setup that I use daily, and basically I figured everything out on my own, really, with trial and error and everything like that. I started off with, a regular 12 volt battery. Naturally, that didn't last very long. We moved on to a regular 12 volt deep cycle battery. That lasted a little longer. Not ideal. Then I started researching different types of 12 volt batteries, and I found RV batteries. They contain a lot more lead. So I used them. They worked better. Then I've switched to marine batteries and things like this. Never got a lot of life out of them. A couple years ago, I discovered Optima batteries. I was very impressed by how long they live, at least what I thought. I have a red top in my truck as a starting battery that is manufactured in 2013, still going strong. So I figured, man, AGM's the way to go. I'll just get some AGM deep cycle batteries and use those for my inverter setup. Well, I got a pair of Interstate deep cycle AGM batteries, and it's been about 2 years, and they're junk now. So I'm going to be upgrading my entire system to run on lithium iron phosphate. But I really wanted to know what did I do wrong? And I've been researching for days, and I think I finally figured out everything that I've been doing wrong. But to my defense, the internet really has a lot of misleading information out there. And that's the problem is, what do you listen to and what do you don't listen to? Well, I really don't know the answer to that question. So let's start off with the basic stuff. The way I always run my inverter setup was I would run my inverter till the low voltage cutoff, disconnects the battery. Never saw a problem with that. When I test my battery's capacity, I always set my meter to disconnect at 10.6 volts. That's what my inverter cuts off at, is 10.6. So I figured, well, if I want to know how many usable amp hours I have, I need to measure until the inverter will cut out. Never really thought much about it, because if you go on Google and you ask the question, how low can you discharge the batteries? A 12 volt battery is going to tell you, oh, just don't go below 10.5 volts and you'll be fine. Well, that's not exactly true. So let's go to this first set of charts here. Alright, so let's go over the different types of batteries and how low they can be safely discharged. So as you can see, each type is very different. So this brings up the question to me of why don't inverters, at least budget inverters, have an adjustable low voltage cutoff? Because as you can see, with your flooded lead acid battery, you really don't need to go much below 50% state of charge, which is 12.7 volts. Well, I always went down to 10.6 wherever my inverter cut off, and that explains why my regular lead acid deep cycle batteries didn't last long at all. Now, from what I can see on the internet, if it was only discharged to 50% and recharged every time, you should be able to get about 500 cycles out of a flooded lead acid. Now, if you always discharge it to 30%, you're only going to get 300 cycles. Anything below 30%, you're going to get 150 cycles or less. And that's pretty consistent with what I was getting out of my lead acid batteries. They'd only last me about a year. And that's it, they were toast. Now, it's okay to occasionally drain them down to this, but not very often. So, this brings up my another point of testing your battery's capacity. Now, a 100 amp hour battery is really a false statement, because with a regular lead acid battery, in my testing anyway, even a brand new battery, I would discharge down to 10.6 volts to test capacity, which now I see is a bad idea. But even discharging down to 10.6 with a regular lead acid battery, you're only going to get 30 to 40 amp hours. All right? So, if we only discharge to 50% capacity, that's not going to be 50 amp hours. I can promise you that. I'm going to say you're going to get between 20 and 25 amp hours. So, I would say for proper testing, obviously you want your batteries to last as long as they can. So to find out for a lead acid battery how many usable amp hours you have, I would say you should only test from fully charged down to 50% state of charge, and that's it. End your test. Let's move on to AGM batteries. Now, like I said, mine lasted me 2 years, and they're done. As you can see, full charge, 100% is 13 volts, 50% is 12.5. Occasionally, you can discharge to 30%, it's 11.81 volts. But a lot of the times I'd discharge down to 10.6. Completely 0% state of charge. So what I found on the internet was you're only going to get about 300 cycles if you discharge down to 0%. Now, if you only discharge down to 50% state of charge, which is 12.5 volts, you should get about 600 cycles out of that. Another thing I kind of forgot to mention is that with flooded lead acid batteries, I may have been overcharging them as well. Because according to various sources, and I do have them here I can show, for a regular flooded lead acid battery, your rate of charge should only be 10% of whatever its rated capacity is. So a 100 amp hour battery, your charge rate should not exceed 10 amps. So being directly hooked to my alternator and being completely depleted, it wasn't uncommon for 20 amps to be flowing in this battery. Now I had a bank of 2, so they would be getting 40 to 50 amps, but obviously you got to split that in 2. So it was not only was I discharging them too far, I was also recharging them too fast. So bad idea. Now for a AGM, the charge rate is 30% of its capacity. So you can charge a 100 amp hour battery at 30 amps and be fine. So my setup in my truck, like I said, is I guess some people call it a parallel setup. I just have a start battery, and then I've got what you would consider house batteries with a relay to disconnect them when the truck's not running. So it would just send full beans, which full beans is about 60 amps. So I wasn't really overcharging my AGMs, but what I think I was doing was not fully charging them enough. So we'll get to that in a second. And then what I'm switching to. So I'm switching to lithium iron phosphate. So there's a guy on YouTube been looking at a lot of his content. He builds his own solar rigs. He builds his own batteries. He's done research for years. I trust what he has to say. And he says it's absolutely fine to discharge your lithium iron phosphate all the way down to 0% state of charge, which is 10 volts. Well, I'm never going to get to 10 volts because my inverter shuts off at 10.6. So it'll have 1 to, maybe 3% state of charge left. But the way I'm sizing my system now is I'm going to have 400 amp hours of capacity. Now, back when I did these two, there was 200 amp hours, 200 amp hours. Interestingly enough, with two brand new flooded lead acid batteries, I would only have maybe 60 amp hours of total capacity. With the AGMs, it was double that. I had about 120, 130 amp hours of capacity. Now, all the research I've done with lithium iron phosphate, if the battery says it has 100 amp hours of capacity, that's 100 amp hours of usable capacity. Unlike these two, which is not the truth. With lithium iron phosphate, it is. So even if I were to, I doubt, I would really have to be doing something crazy to use 400 amp hours worth of electricity in a day at work without recharging. But even if I did manage to do that, I'd still get 2,000 cycles out of these batteries. I mean, we're talking 300 I got with AGM and 150 with lead acid. So these lithium iron phosphates lithium iron phosphate batteries are just far superior. Now, I have to change my rig around a little bit because you can't just hook these straight to your starting battery and charge, because these things will take every amp you can shove to them, and it'll actually suck your starter battery dry and burn up your alternator. So I have to install a DC to DC charger, which I'm going to do. And I'm going to make a separate video on this. I'm going to show my old rig before I take it apart, and I'm going to show the new rig once I put it back together. But I just wanted to show the different types of batteries, 12-volt batteries. These are both considered to be lead acid batteries, even though this is AGM. And what you can expect as far as capacity-wise and everything else. Now, the batteries that I bought, these interstate batteries, I paid roughly $180 for. And these lithium iron phosphate batteries, I've paid, I think, $220 something a piece. And they're 200 amp hour batteries versus 100 amp hours. And you can see by the numbers, I'm going to get way more life out of these things, even if I abuse them, which I'm not planning to. But I should be able to get at least 6 to 10 years out of these things, even being heavily abused. So that's the different type of batteries. I'm going to end this video. The next video, I'm going to discuss something that I think contributed to the death of my AGM batteries, and that was not charging them properly. So this video is going to be about the different types of 12-volt batteries. Next, I'm going to go over charging and something interesting that I learned. It's a process called equalizing, and there's a lot of different information about it. So stay tuned to the next episode.